Hello, bonsoir. Welcome to the 28th Rendezvous with Madness Festival. My name is Scott Miller-Berry. I'm Managing Director at Workman Arts, presenters of Rendezvous with Madness, and a member of the Film Programming Committee. Welcome to the panel discussion for the film Veins of the World by Ambasurin Dava. We're very grateful to be joined by moderator Jamie Kneen of the Mining Watch Canada, along with Rachel Small from Mining and Justice Solidarity Network, and Leah Gardner of the Justice and Corporate Accountability Project, JCAP. Thank you to our ASL interpreter from Closed Caption Services and our ASL interpreter from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service. Rendezvous with Madness and Workman Arts would like to acknowledge the Indigenous lands on which we are presently located, and we ask you to take a moment to think about the land in which you are currently gathered. Toronto comes from the Mohawk word Toronto, which can be translated loosely as where the trees meet the water. It's part of the traditional territories of many nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Rendezvous recognizes this is an ongoing dialogue, and acknowledgement is just that, an acknowledgement. We are grateful to live and work on this land with all people, those indigenous to Turtle Island and those from all over the world. We value inclusivity, anti-oppression, and safety at all levels. We all have a role to play in maintaining these spirits. Please see our statement and code of conduct on our website at workmanarts.com, and please ensure you're treating everyone with respect. We'd like to thank the short film that played alongside Veins of the World, the film Blues Side on the Blue Sky by Rahmat Hidayat Mustamin from Makassar, Indonesia. Thanks to our co-presenters for this program, the Goethe Institute Toronto, Mining Watch Canada, the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network, and the Planet in Focus Environmental Film Festival. We hope that you'll ask questions tonight during this discussion. Please type it into the chat box on the upper right-hand side of your screen. A friendly reminder, if you're watching tonight with full screen, you'll need to minimize your screen to see the chat box. It's a reminder the discussion is held in English with simultaneous ASL interpretation and live captions. Our moderator, Jamie, will choose questions tonight, and we do apologize in advance if we're not able to get to all the questions within the allotted time, which is about 30 to 45 minutes. We also have an active listener joining us, Christine, who is on the call. If you need to step off the call, you can text or call them if you require support. You can contact Christine directly at 289-779-4114 or email at Christine, CHRISTEEN .SALIK@gmail.com. The contact info for our virtual supportive listener is also on our website under the Veins of the World page in the black box on the right. We do value making time for difficult discussions at Rendezvous, but we do respect that you know your own limits and you'll seek out any support if you need it. On behalf of the programming committee for the films, I would love to share our excitement for this discussion. We were all blown away by this film. It's such a personal, poignant, political, insightful and gentle film, Veins of the World, by Ambasurin Dava, pardon me. We're really excited for this discussion tonight, and thank you to all the speakers. I'd now like to turn things over to Jamie, our moderator, to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. That was fantastic. And I'm, on behalf of Mining Watch Canada, very happy to be part of this and be part of the presentation of the film. Mining Watch has been around for 20 years now. We're based in Ottawa. I'm speaking to you from unceded Algonquin territory on the Ottawa River, the confluence of the Ottawa, Rideau, and Gatineau rivers, and a traditional meeting place for thousands of years. So we work on mining in Canada and mining related issues, environmental issues, labor rights, Indigenous rights. And we also work on Canadian mining companies interests internationally. Canadian mining companies are dominant worldwide in the mining sector. The largest number of the largest number of mining companies are registered or based in Canada. And so it's a very, we have a very powerful position as Canadians, whether we know it or not, in terms of the global extraction of metals and minerals and the economic, but also the social and personal costs and effects of that extraction. As consumers, as investors, as citizens, we're all part of this. And I have to say, the film was a bit of a departure in that sense for me and for our work, because we do a lot of work with documentaries and documentation around, these mining operations and their impacts and that kind of thing. We don't often get to see the other side of that operation. And in fact, the film doesn't really even show that, the bigger picture, the investors and so on. And it's really a contrast to a lot of the work that we do, but not a contrast to the experience. And, part of our work is also working with people in communities, whether that's in Canada or in other parts of the world, who are dealing with the effects and impacts of these mining operations. And that's really, I think, why this was so compelling for me, and why we're really happy to be here talking about it. Before I go on any further, though, I want to stop and ask Rachel and Leah, what really stood out from the film? What really grabbed you about the film when you watched it? I don't know who wants to go first. Leah, do you want to go first?
Sure. I just want to say before I speak, thank you very much for having us. I really loved the film. Thought it told a really beautiful story. I'd say the part that stood out the most for me was the scene at the end, where the mother is sitting down with her family and her neighbors and starting to organize to fight for her rights and her family's rights in relation to mining. We see the kind of camera pan out to what appears to be a large scale mine, and you get the sense that this large scale mine has been affecting the small scale mining operations that you see in the movie, and affecting their access to land, access to water, threatening their livelihood. And it's just an empowering scene when you see her get down and start working. For me, my reaction is, well, I know this woman. This badass woman is in countries all across the world and regions across the world. And as part of our work, we're a legal clinic based in Canada, and we work with communities who are affected by multinational mining companies. And as part of our work, we see all the time how social movements and organized communities can really have an impact, and really have a lot of success. And so, we see this character throughout the movie being amazing. And then you see her at the end, bringing people together. And so it's exciting, because I know that she can really have an impact. The flip side of that is the I also felt anxiety for her, because I know how social leaders in communities where mining takes place are often targeted and for violence and criminalized, and generally their lives are made very, very, very difficult. So there's kind of this, it captures for me this kind of dual feeling of excitement and empowerment, but at the same time anxiety and fear for this character as she moves forward.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Rachel? What did you take away, just sort of initial impressions?
Yeah, thank you. I also really appreciated the movie. And I think what I appreciated most, and also one thing I really took away, was that it really highlighted, I feel, the complexity of the situation. It didn't, it just felt to me like a very honest depiction of what really happens on the ground in a place where people's whole kind of lives are being upturned and people have choices, often not actual sort of free choices. If the choice is, we're not going to be able to keep livestock here, or resell to the company, I mean, it's not a wonderful choice, but I feel like folks in Canada who maybe don't work directly with mining impacted communities, but maybe read the news, see the headlines, you could sort of think that these are kind of black and white struggles, that there's communities that want to protect their land and a company has come in and they're resisting in these ways and there's repression. That is a true story, but I feel like this movie really highlighted how complex it is, the ways in which communities get divided, people who maybe didn't want there to be mining on their land, but at the same time don't feel like they have another choice, might make deals with mining companies. And these are complex, full humans who also care about their connection to land, who also care about their community and might decide to sell their land to a company. That's just sort of one example. And I feel like it didn't try to romanticize a certain way of life or a certain absence of technology. Mining companies often try to tell a story of development, of progress, of we're going to bring this to this community. I mean, on one level, it's often not true in terms of the impact on the ground, in terms of where the money flows, but it also is, it often relies on these kind of colonial tropes of backwards Indigenous people and modern progress. And I think this film, in just honestly trying to honestly depict people's lives and the real struggles that came up, I just think Gabe did a really nuanced job of showing this clash of multinational mining corporation versus herders in Mongolia.
Do you want to take that further? Are there particular things that struggles that you've been involved with, or people that you've been working with that maybe you were reminded of in that situation?
Sure. Yeah, I organize with the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network. I should have said that off the bat. So we're a grassroots group of activists here in Toronto that for about at least 10 years now have been working in solidarity with communities around the world at the front lines of these same sort of struggles. We're based here in Toronto because we consider Toronto to be a deeply mining impacted community, not because we're the site of the excavation and the extraction, but because we are where the decisions are being made overwhelmingly in boardrooms, on the Toronto Stock Exchange, via the spaces investors convene, that have these enormous impacts on people's lives around the world. We call Toronto the belly of the beast, and that's why we say that our work is based here. So we are often trying to sort of bridge a gap between or bring the real conflict of these mines to these boardrooms, to these spaces where the mining companies meet. In some cases, supporting community members at the mine site and coming to Toronto and indirectly confronting these executives about what is the harm that's happening. In other cases, via documentation, and and then trying to address the fact that this is not a story of a few companies who are maybe acting in ways that we wouldn't like, but this is the mining industry, and this is really the story of Canada. I mean, Canada fundamentally, just to expand slightly, is a state that's just simply built on the removal of Indigenous people from their land for resource extraction. It's sort of the same story that we see from Mi'kmaq to Six Nations, just 100 kilometers away from where I am, to the Wet'suwet'en struggle on the West Coast. That's just the headlines this week. But that's kind of what the Canadian state was built on. And then increasingly over the past century, built also on the removal of Indigenous people from their land in other parts of the world, to then take that gold, that silver, that uranium, that whatever, and fund Bay Street here, to kind of put it simply. So we see this dynamic all over the place. And I have to say that in the movie, I was sure we were going to find out that the father had died because, I hope this is not a spoiler, I hope everyone's watched the movie. I was sure we were going to find out that the father had died because of something to do with the mining company, because honestly, the number of communities I've worked in, as Leah alluded to, where people who've been involved in resisting or challenging or trying to get a better deal about a mine for their community have been assassinated is overwhelming, and you come to expect it. I was, this is a bit of a tangent, but I was living in Guatemala several years ago, working with communities who were resisting about 10 different huge Canadian mines all across that country, some of which were in the process of being proposed, some of which were already poisoning their livestock because they'd been in operation 10 years. And I received the news that Jack Layden had died, and he was on international news in Guatemala, and the immediate response from everyone was, who killed the Canadian social leader? And no one could and the immediate response was, if someone who's involved in social movements has died, this is an assassination, because that was their experience. Hopefully not too much of a tangent, but that was the norm.
Wow, yeah. Leah, how about you? Are there any specific struggles that you've been working on that maybe this brought you to?
Well, I mean, just going off of the idea that it's a systemic conflict is a systemic problem with Canadian mining. I mean, I think it might even be the norm. Honestly, JCAP, we put out a study a few years back where we looked at mining conflicts associated with Canadian mines in Latin America from year 2000 to 2015. And it was really shocking, the extent of the conflict and the level of violence, especially violence targeted at community leaders, Indigenous leaders, people who were organizing against Canadian mines. Just to give you an idea, we found we documented, which is I'm positive is just the tip of the iceberg, but 34 violent conflicts involving 28 different Canadian mining companies across 13 different countries, 44 deaths, 4 disappearances, 30 of those deaths were targeted killings, and many, many injuries. And, you know, we're talking about beloved community leaders, priests, youth activists, so teenagers, women, labor leaders, really just people who are really important to communities and movements in those countries. And we weren't able to get into, you know, the trauma that causes for families, for communities, but it's real. And I think what we concluded at the end of that study is that you know, it seems to be the norm. You have these cases where, you know, you have projects that have such a huge impact on the land and on the community. In the movie, it comes up a couple times. They talk about companies promising to renature the land, and it's the impact is so intense. I mean, just from an environmental standpoint, of course, it's not just about filling the hole in. There'll be environmental impacts for years and years, hundreds of years, even after a large-scale mine closes. But also just the social impact, the social effects of a mine like that. So you have these huge mines coming in with these massive effects, often on indigenous land or land where people have a very deep connection to the natural environment, to that land, where their livelihoods, their lives depend on that land. So you have huge impacts in these very special places, and also in jurisdictions, places in the world where there might be a lack of regulation, or at worse, it could be a place where organized crime is really present, or corruption is really present. And so, of course, you're going to get violent conflict. Of course, you're going to have these lasting effects, not just on the natural environment, but on society as a whole. So, yeah, you know, sometimes we hear, oh, it's a case of a few bad apples. There's just a few poorly run Canadian mines around the world. But that, I don't think that's the case. I think it's systemic. It might even be the norm.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to remind people, viewers, folks at home, please chime in if you've got comments or questions. Let us know, and we'll address them. And yeah, I think for me, what really stood out was the way that the film really looks into the family and the community and the relationships and the stress and the pressure that people are under. So we know that there is a large scale mine somewhere out there draining the water table, that the pastures are running dry, that it's really hard for people to make a living, that they've turned to small scale mining, but all the conflict around that, and not just the interpersonal conflict, but the internal conflict, like Rachel was talking about, the difficulty of trying to make decisions when you're not really sure what your options even are, or how you negotiate that, how you navigate that landscape, within a family, within a community, with people that have, worked and lived together for generations, and now no longer have the same basis even for surviving. And it's something that you don't really see from the outside. Like, as you were saying, we see the obvious violence, we see the big changes to the landscape, we see the headlines, and I think really appreciating the tension internally is really important. And we can talk about social conflict, blah blah blah, but really, what does that actually mean to people individually? Like, what does that mean inside? How do you feel that? And I think the film really did a fantastic job of opening that up, both, and contrasting it, and not romanticizing the nomadic way of life, which was not easy, but which has its own rewards. And then the change that's not even negotiated, it's just imposed. But how do people handle that? So we do have a question, and again, again, folks, please ask questions, make comments, let us know what you're thinking, and we can all have a part in this. The question is, does anyone know more about the current situation in mining in Mongolia to understand the context? And I guess I'll take a stab at that, because basically there is one really big Canadian copper mine that that's been working in Mongolia for a number of years. A lot of the mining that's going on there is actually for coal, and it's basically being shipped to China. So these are Chinese interests that have moved in, as I say, mostly in coal, some in metal like copper and gold, but a lot of that is just feeding the Chinese industrial machinery. And but at the same time, there's this huge Canadian mining complex that is it's been very controversial. There's been we've got actually some interesting stuff on our website about the way that the Canadian and U.S. diplomatic corps pressured the Mongolian government, and how this particular mine has actually been at the center of a lot of political controversy, and possibly even one coup in Mongolia, because there's been a couple of parliamentary coups in Mongolia, a lot of it around mining and the revenue and bribery and corruption and the kind of money that's thrown around, and the ability of large mining companies like Turquoise Hill to push governments around with the aid of the World Bank, with the aid of Canadian and US embassies, to tell the Mongolian government what their conditions are, rather than any kind of fair negotiation that would allow the Mongolians a chance to put things straight. And as I say, corruption. And of course, corruption isn't something that people do in other countries. It's something that involves two sides, and something that Canada has been extremely poor in policing. We always say that Canada, or well, the Canadian government likes to say that we have, we come down hard on corruption, but the OECD just came out with a report saying, no, we don't. And that certainly backs up our experience that the Canadian government actually does have a law against paying bribes to foreign officials, but is very poorly enforced and investigated. So, and then the other thing that's going on in mining in Mongolia is there is a lot of small-scale gold mining, in particular, because it is accessible. It's very destructive, but as we saw in the film, when people have lost their livelihoods to landscape change, to climate change, which maybe global climate change, it may be local, related to mining operations sucking up all the groundwater, but then people turn to things like small-scale mining, and it's very dangerous, but it allows them to make some money and survive. I know I've monopolized that one. I should ask if either Rachel or Leah, if either of you want to comment on that.
Well, in terms of small scale mining too, in my experience, you see just that, if people kind of being pushed into it, and then we've seen conflicts in Latin America where they're then small scale miners are then criminalized and really oppressed in a way to kind of push them off of the land to make way for multinational companies to come in, including Canadian companies. So that's something that I've definitely seen in our work.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that while I don't know a ton about Mongolia specifically, the bit that I do know, it does seem to be analogous to kind of many other regions of the world where, of course, there's been some degree of mining that is traditional, that has been going on in some cases for centuries, in some cases for thousands of years, but really in the past 20 years has been this huge boom of mining in Mongolia. And as I think think it was the very last slide of the movie that sort of said that a third of the country is currently in some version of a mining concession, whether a proposal, whether to be looked into, whether it's an
Yeah.
stage of exploration. Some are obviously currently being exploited. That this is a fundamental change to the country, to the land, to the way of life. The mine that Jamie started off by mentioning, Oyu Tolgoi, it's slated to be actually the largest copper mine in the world, according to the company developing it, the Canadian mine. It is projected to, once it's in full production, the profits per year are slated to be a third of Mongolia's GDP. So this is not just like a project. This is right now like the industrial project of Mongolia. And I think there's a lot of like common sense thinking that comes around that, like, oh, something that big, that money like will fundamentally change how the country feels like to the average citizen, that it will develop jobs in certain ways, that it will, and I mean, I'm not an expert on Mongolia, but what we see in many places is that a lot of those profits will not go to the communities anywhere near where the mine is based. And in fact, I know that there's been some interesting reporting recently, and I think Mining Watch was involved in this, highlighting that even the profits that are meant to stay in the country and that are meant to come to Canada are being evaded by the company as well. And there's been some tax evasion scandals. I believe it was up to $500 million that was owed to Canadian taxes that have been evaded through sort of tax havens and subsidiaries and complex structures. So those are profits that are meant to go to Canada that are not reaching it. And then there's certainly the same thing happening in Mongolia. And then of what goes to the government of Mongolia, how much will ever go back to the regions where the mine happens? Past experience says not very much. I can't speak to what's happening on the ground there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, we've got a couple of other questions, kind of related questions. One is that one says, I was impressed the film didn't focus on the mining company, but more on the family and villagers. It made me reflect on the mental health impacts to Amra and his family. Do you have any thoughts about this? And the other is, in your experience, what happens to the Indigenous communities that start having mining activity on their land, especially in regards to mental health, youth, and education? So we could be here for a while discussing these. Do you want to take on any of that? Rachel, maybe?
Maybe let's start with Leah, since I was just speaking.
Sure.
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 Yeah, I think I have pretty limited experience working directly with communities on the ground, so I can't speak for them and the mental health impact that has. I spent some time a few years back in Colombia working, living in some rural communities that were organizing against a Canadian mine there, and I from my personal experience there, this was a project that was just in the exploration phase, so the very beginning, and just the stress and the stress was palpable in the community. You know, there's kind of like divide and conquer tactics sometimes with companies where they'll hire you know, one member of a bunch of different families at the very beginning to be like promoters for the mine. So you have like one member of the family that has some kind of income from the company at the beginning. So you have these community divisions, but also family divisions. So your cousin is working for the mine, but you feel that your farm is completely threatened by it because you're going to get expropriated.
Yeah.
And just the level of anxiety that I mean, I obviously, as I said, I can't speak for people living it, but from what I observed, it was very, very intense, especially in countries where armed conflict is an ongoing thing or a recent memory. It's terrifying, and really, really difficult for people who are already, in marginalized situations, don't have access to mental health support, and yeah, really, really difficult.
Yeah. Maybe I'll say a few things, because I lived in northern Saskatchewan and in the Dene community, next to a uranium mine that is still there. It's been going on since the 70s, and I think, the sense of powerlessness, I think, is perhaps the most devastating impact when something's happening on your own land. Like literally, the people's cabins and trap lines and burial grounds have been bulldozed to make way for mines, and they were consulted. There was a meeting held beforehand where they were informed of what was going to happen, and they said, this was back in 1975. They said, no thanks, we don't want that. And of course it kept happening. And I think both collectively and individually, that sense of of powerlessness, of lack of control, and personal personal powerlessness is really devastating. Coming on top of, in the Canadian context, coming on top of residential schools and on top of exclusion and poverty. So some Indigenous leaders have been very eloquent and devastating about this, talking about how our poverty is being used as a weapon against us. And the way that you were saying, Leah, that there's an offer of jobs and people are, this is held out as development, and there's no acknowledgement, quite deliberately, about what it means to both the land-based way of life itself, but also to people's own relationships. So I think that, and is presented sometimes as a way out, to say, well, if you, if you get to grade 10 and you can train and become a miner, then that's a way out of poverty and a way out of the dead end of a small community. And I think in some cases people resist that actively as well. They don't want to be part of that process, and yet their options are very limited. So it has a real impact. Rachel, over to you. Do you have any thoughts on that either question? So the other one was about the mental health impacts on Emra and his family in particular.
Yeah, I think one thing that I appreciated about this movie was that it really delved into how, sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. I'm going to ignore it and hopefully you can all hear me. Yeah.
This is Zoom experience, eh?
Yeah, that's it. They really showed how complex this experience is, without feeling like they needed to make it the most dramatic story possible, or create the worst circumstances for you to feel empathy and sympathy for these characters. To be honest, looking at their story, to me, this looked like early impacts of a developing mine. Like, you can't have an open pit mine without not only like lowering the water table, but also poisoning the water without. And I know that mines across Mongolia have had that impact, that there's been terrible. There's like, you could Google mining in Mongolia livestock and you'll see tons of photos of dead livestock, of animals born with really strange birth defects that have never been seen in that part of Asia. So just even looking at like, what will the impacts on water in this semi-fictionalized, let's say, community look like a few years down the line, it's so much worse. And if you look at even just that one aspect, like to imagine, for me, it's to imagine, because it's not my lived experience, the constant doubt of, am I drinking poisoned water? Am I feeding my kid poisoned water? Am I cooking and washing with it? Which is a shared experience in many Indigenous communities in Canada too, of course. This is not something to go to the other side of the world for. So just that one aspect of the water, there's such a sort of range of experience. I've heard one thing that really stuck with me, someone in a community that was fighting off a mine in Peru once said, it feels like a natural disaster has struck, but we're supposed to be grateful. Like their land, their community, everything has been destroyed. And yet what's being shared sort of in the news and the propaganda is how fortunate this community is that this mine is here. Meanwhile, they know they're being poisoned. Meanwhile, they can't do the livelihoods they've had for generations. And meanwhile, they sort of see no future ahead of them, but they're sort of being celebrated. And I mean, you could share a similar story in Attawapiskat, where they settled the agreement between the famous De Beers diamond mine there and the community of Attawapiskat was sort of celebrated as this amazing consensus agreement or impact benefit agreement, or they use different words, between the Indigenous community and a diamond mine, and look how well this could go. Yeah, in terms of really being mutually supportive and all that. And then, of course, just a few years ago, Attawapiskat declared a state of emergency, and turns out there was little positive impact from one of the world's biggest diamond mines being on their land. And in fact, they were facing calamity. So, I mean, yeah, we can talk about mental health impacts, but we're talking about the mental health impacts in so many cases of your entire life and community being uprooted.
Yeah, and I think, you know, going back to what I was saying before, I think it's important to note the suicide crisis, the suicide pandemic that is striking Indigenous youth in particular, but people of all ages actually across northern Canada in particular. It's just astonishing, and you know, and I have to say that I bring it up because I think it has to be mentioned, it has to be recognized, and it's good to recognize that there are people struggling to bring not just treatment and training, but you know, comprehensive programs. You know, the Inuit leadership in particular, and the Anishinaabe Nation. Sorry, the Anishinaabe Nation in Ontario have been very strong in developing and with very little help from the federal government, I have to say, developing strategies around addressing suicide, and you know, and I think it a lot of it relates to that sense of powerlessness and, you know, lack of control over your own future. So with that, I would like to thank you, Rachel and Leah, for participating. Thank you to the audience for the questions. That was excellent. Those are excellent questions. And I think I get to hand it back to Scott now to wrap up for the evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Leah. Would all of you like to share the websites or contact info for your respective organizations for the audience?
Sure.
Sure. So I work with the Justice and Corporate Accountability Project, and our website is, I had to actually pull it up. It's a justice-project.org.
And the Mining Injustice Solidarity Network, our website is just mininginjustice.org.
And Mining Watch Canada is miningwatch.ca.
Thank you. We'd love to thank all of you for your time and your contributions to the discussion tonight, which really, really nicely contextualized veins of the world, especially around mining, you know, activism around mining and impacts to Indigenous people, all over the globe, and Canada's being complicit in, can't find the word, sorry, in these ongoing dilemmas. It's a brief reminder to the audience that Rendezvous is happening until Sunday, so there's still 2 and a bit more days of films and workshops, an online virtual exhibition with performance documentation and artist talks. So please check our website, workmanarts.com. Everything is pay what you can or free. All of our live talks are ASL interpreted and captioned. I want to thank our interpreter and our captioner this evening. And then last but not least, we will be sending out to those of you who registered for the film and or the talk, we'll be sending an email with a link to an audience survey. We live for feedback at Rendezvous with Madness, so we would love to hear your thoughts about the film and or the panel tonight, and give us suggestions for anything you'd like us to be doing in the future. So with that, again, thanks Rachel, thanks Leah, thanks Jamie, and thank you to the audience, and wishing you a wonderful evening.
Thank you.